"Get out, kid. This isn't a charity." The baker barked, slamming his flour-stained hand on the counter, as little Sophie clutched her coins, trembling but refusing to move. Her voice cracked. "But it's my birthday. Can I just blow out one candle?" The room went silent until a man in a tailored suit rose from the corner, his eyes burning with something no one expected. What would you have done in that moment? The late afternoon sun draped the narrow streets of Florence in a golden light, the kind that made the cobblestones shimmer as if they had soaked in centuries of stories. Inside a modest bakery on Via Roma, the smell of fresh bread and sugar dust hung heavy in the air. The glass display glistened with rows of pastries, but tucked near the corner was a single cake, small and simple with a strawberry perched on top. A little girl stood in front of the counter. Her sweater was worn thin, her shoes scuffed. She couldn't have been more than 7. She clutched a crumpled piece of paper in her hand and pressed her lips together before speaking. "Excuse me," she said softly, almost like a secret. "It's my birthday today. Could I just blow out one candle on that cake?" The baker, a tired man with flour smudged on his apron, froze for a moment. His eyes flicked from her small frame to the paper in her hand, then to the line of paying customers waiting impatiently. He gave a tight laugh, more irritation than kindness. "This is not a charity ragazza. If you don't have money, you cannot have cake. A candle costs 2. A silence fell. The girl lowered her eyes, gripping the edge of the counter as though trying to hold her ground. She whispered, "Please. Just one candle. I don't need to eat it." From a corner table, a man in a dark tailored suit had been watching. Alexander Pierce was an American businessman, a name that carried weight in boardrooms from New York to Singapore. He had flown to Florence for meetings expecting numbers and negotiations, not a child asking for a birthday candle. Yet, something in her voice, firm, steady, despite the sting of rejection, cut through the noise of his own world. He rose before he had fully decided what to do. His shoes clicked against the tile as every eye turned toward him. "I'll take that cake," he said to the baker. His tone was calm but firm, the kind of voice that once closed billion-dollar deals. "All of it, and add the biggest candle you have." The baker blinked, caught off guard, then quickly wrapped the cake with clumsy hands. Alexander turned to the girl, who stared at him with wide, uncertain eyes. He bent, slightly lowering his voice to her level. "What's your name, Sophie?" she said, barely above a whisper. "Well, Sophie," he replied, "how about we celebrate your birthday properly?" The shop moments earlier, tense with awkwardness, now buzzed with murmurs. Alexander carried the cake to a corner table and gestured for Sophie to sit. She hesitated, then slid into the chair, her legs too short to reach the floor. He placed the cake between them, lit the candle, and pushed it toward her. The flame flickered small but steady. Sophie leaned in, eyes shining with a mixture of disbelief and hope. She closed her eyes tightly, folded her hands, and made a wish in silence. When she blew out the candle, the flame vanished, leaving only a faint curl of smoke, but her face glowed as if she had captured the light inside herself. Alexander studied her, feeling something stir in his chest he hadn't felt in years. He had spent his life surrounded by opulence, never short of choices or luxuries. Yet here was a child asking only for the dignity of a single candle, not a slice of cake, not a gift, just the symbol of being seen. "What did you wish for?" he asked. Sophie smiled faintly, but shook her head. "If I tell, it won't come true." They shared the cake, though she ate only a small piece, saving the rest carefully in a napkin, as if each bite was precious. Between mouthfuls, she began to speak in fragments. Her mother had passed when she was very young, she explained. She lived now with her grandmother, who was often sick and too weak to work. Sophie sold flowers on the streets near the cathedral, hoping to earn enough for bread. She spoke without self-pity, just a matter-of-fact honesty that unsettled him. Alexander listened, each word pressing deeper than the last. He thought of the board meeting scheduled that evening in Milan, the one he couldn't miss, the one his assistant had reminded him about 3 times already. His world was measured in contracts, deadlines, and strategy. Yet across from him sat a girl whose world revolved around survival and the fragile hope of her grandmother's health. He glanced toward the bakery window where Florence's bustling piazza moved on without noticing the tiny drama unfolding inside. It struck him how invisible she must be to most, and for the first time in years, Alexander Pierce, who prided himself on control and detachment, felt profoundly unsettled. As Sophie wiped the crumbs from her plate, she looked at him with a seriousness too old for her age. "Thank you," she said. "No one's ever done that for me before." Alexander held her gaze and found himself unable to respond with the usual polite phrases. Instead, he said quietly, "You deserve more than this. Much more." The words surprised him as much as they surprised her. They carried no agenda, no calculation, just truth. And as he walked her out of the bakery into the dusky Florence evening, he realized that in the space of a single candle, something inside him had shifted. He had entered the bakery, a man chasing another deal. He left it, carrying something far heavier and infinitely more important, a responsibility he had not expected, but could no longer ignore. The night air of Florence wrapped itself around the city with a kind of hushed reverence. The narrow streets glowed under lanterns, and the sound of shoes against cobblestone echoed softly between the ancient walls. Alexander Pierce and Sophie walked side by side, the remnants of the cake carefully tucked into a small bakery box Sophie cradled as though it were treasure. She didn't chatter the way children often did. Instead, she seemed to carry silence the way others carried luggage heavier than it should have been, but too familiar to notice. Alexander guided her to a quiet bench near the Arno River. The lights shimmered on the water's surface, and the soft hum of conversation from distant cafes floated in the night air. He sat down, waiting. Sophie eventually followed, clutching the box tighter. She looked older in that moment, like someone holding on to more than she should. "You didn't really eat much," he said gently. She shrugged. "I'm saving it for tomorrow. My grandmother likes strawberries. She hasn't had anything sweet in a long time." Her words were simple, but they hit Alexander like a stone. He had been prepared for a sad story. Poverty always carried one, but the way she said it with calm certainty revealed a strength that unsettled him. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Tell me about her." Sophie's eyes softened. "Her name's Clara. She used to sing when she cooked. Now she coughs too much and sometimes she can't get out of bed. I try to help, but she tells me I should play instead. Only I can't, because if I don't sell flowers, we don't have enough." Alexander listened in silence, letting her words fill the space between them. She wasn't asking for pity. She was telling him the facts of her life, as if reciting the weather-cold nights, empty plates, fading hope. He wondered when she had learned to speak with such restraint, when childhood had been replaced by duty. She placed the box on her lap and folded her hands. "I made a wish when I blew out the candle." He turned toward her. "And what was it?" This time, she didn't hold it back. "That Grandma gets well, and that I never have to be hungry again." The honesty in her voice left no room for comfort. Alexander's throat tightened. For decades, his life had been built on transactions, on measurable outcomes. But what could he give her? Money could buy medicine, food, shelter, but it couldn't erase the years she had already endured, the quiet loneliness of nights spent worrying about someone she loved. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen blinked with messages, reminders of a meeting in Milan that evening with investors who would not take kindly to delays. For a moment, he hesitated, torn between the empire he had built and the fragile thread of connection forming here. Then he placed the phone face down beside him. "Sophie," he said, "I need to leave for a few hours tonight, but I'll come back tomorrow, I promise." She looked at him with steady, skeptical eyes. Everyone always says they'll come back. They don't. Her words struck deeper than he expected. He wanted to argue, to assure her he was different. But the look on her face, too old, too accustomed to disappointment, stopped him. Instead, he nodded. "Then let me prove it." He rose from the bench and she followed reluctantly. He arranged for a driver to take her home, and though she resisted at first, the lure of keeping the cake safe convinced her. Before she climbed into the car, she turned to him, clutching the box. "If you don't come back, I'll know." "I will," he said. And for once the promise felt like an obligation carved into stone. The hours in Milan dragged like years. He sat through presentations, numbers flashing across screens, while his mind drifted back to the girl on the riverbank. When his sister Margaret leaned in during a break and whispered, "You look distracted." Something wrong. He dismissed her with a shake of his head. But deep down he knew something was wrong. His world no longer fit as neatly as it once had. By the time he returned to Florence, the streets were quieter. He walked toward the hotel where he was staying, only to notice a small figure sitting near the entrance. Her backpack beside her, her head bowed. Sophie. She had not gone home. She had waited. When she saw him, she stood quickly, the box still clutched in her arms. "You came back." He swallowed hard. "Of course I did." She relaxed slightly, but her posture still carried the stiffness of someone who had learned not to trust easily. Then, as if suddenly remembering, she pulled the bakery box open and showed him the slice she had saved. "See for Grandma. She'll smile when she sees it." In that moment, Alexander understood. This wasn't just about hunger or sickness. It was about hope. She carried hope like it was fragile glass, and yet she held it tightly, refusing to let it break. The night might have ended there, but fate had other plans. As they walked back toward the driver's car, a group of boys loitering near the alley began shouting. They noticed Alexander's sleek car parked along the curb and crowded closer, daring one another to touch it. Sophie's eyes widened. Without hesitation, she ran forward, arms outstretched. "Stop!" she shouted, placing herself between the car and the boys. "Don't touch it." The boys laughed, one of them pushing her shoulder lightly, but she stood firm, chin lifted in defiance. Alexander hurried forward, his voice sharp as he ordered them away. They scattered reluctantly, muttering curses under their breath. He turned to Sophie, his heart pounding. "Why would you do that? You could have been hurt." She hugged the box closer. "It's your car. You were kind to me. I couldn't let them ruin something of yours." Her words sank deep. She had risked herself not for cake, not for pity, but for loyalty. The kind of loyalty that expected nothing in return. Alexander placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "You don't need to protect me. That's my job now." Sophie tilted her head, studying him as though weighing the truth of his statement. Then quietly she said, "If that's true, then maybe my wish will come true after all." The city around them seemed to hush. For Alexander Pierce, who had spent years insulating himself from the weight of promises, the moment marked a turning point. This was no longer just an act of charity. It was a responsibility, one he could not walk away from. And as they drove toward the small home she shared with Clara, he realized that a single candle had set fire to something he could no longer ignore. The driver turned off the main road and followed Sophie's directions through a web of alleys where Florence gave way to the city's forgotten edges. Locksmith shops with rusted signs, garages that never seemed to close, narrow gardens held together by wire and hope. He parked beside a lane that dead-ended at a shed patched from scrap wood and corrugated tin. A single bulb hung over the doorway. Sophie hugged the bakery box to her chest and looked up at Alexander as if bracing him for what he was about to see. Inside, the air was cool and faintly medicinal. Eucalyptus rubbed into cloth alcohol from a half-used bottle boiled water in a dented kettle. A crate doubled as a table, 2 mugs, a notebook. On a low cot beneath a small window lay a woman whose gray braid fell over one shoulder. She was thin, not from fashion, but from arithmetic, too many days where meals were more idea than reality. Still, her eyes were steady, and when Sophie said, "Nonna, this is Mr. K," Pierce, the woman's expression softened in welcome rather than embarrassment. "I'm Clara," she said in English, careful and precise. "You brought my granddaughter home safe." "Grazie." Sophie set the cake down and cut a modest wedge, almost ceremonial. Clara inhaled the strawberry and closed her eyes, as if scent alone could stir appetite. A cough took her then, low, wet, stubborn. She pressed a cloth to her lips until it passed, turned the cloth over, and smoothed the blanket as though apologizing for the interruption. Alexander pulled a chair beside the cot. "When did a doctor last see you?" Clara lifted a shoulder. "A clinic once. But without documents the line is long and the medicine is short." She nodded toward the labeled bottle's cough-suppressant antibiotics with dates long past herbal syrup. "Neighbors help sometimes." Sophie's posture shifted, a quiet straightening he was beginning to recognize. "We buy what we can," she said. "When I sell flowers, we get bread. When I don't, we make soup." It wasn't self-pity, it was inventory. He took out his phone and stepped just outside for signal. The private hospital his foundation supported answered on the first ring. The tone changed when he mentioned no ID. Policies, compliance, exposure. The administrator's voice stayed courteous and immovable. Admissions required documentation, proof of address, a formal referral. The public hospital she suggested might take a look, but it would help to arrive with paperwork in hand. Alexander came back in and met Clara's eyes. "If I arrange a physician to come here in the morning, will you let him examine you?" He kept his voice calm, anchoring the room where nerves threatened to fray. Clara nodded, then glanced at Sophie. "As long as it is safe." Sophie spoke before he could. "They told us once that asking for help without papers could mean I go to a home." The way she said it made clear it wasn't a myth, but a warning absorbed into bone. He sat on the crate and lowered his voice. "I won't sign you up for any risk without your permission. The first step is medical. The second is getting your documents in motion. Both can happen." The phone buzzed. Margaret. "Where did you disappear to?" his sister asked the moment he answered. "Milan is not impressed by absence. I'm with a child and her grandmother on the outskirts of Florence," he said. "She needs a doctor. Tonight, if I can manage it." Silence. Then a sigh sharpened into steel. "Alexander, do not involve yourself personally. Make a donation. Call a charity. But distance yourself. You are a single man with a very public profile. Do you understand how quickly that becomes a story you can't control?" "There's a human being in front of me who can't breathe," he replied. "I'm not workshopping optics. You are steward of a company. One bad headline and we lose a deal. Then another. It's not about cold hearts, it's about fiduciary duty." Her voice softened a notch. "Please, at least keep this at arm's length. Communicate through counsel. Protect yourself." He looked at Sophie's notebook on the table, dates and euros, earned doses given nights, slept sitting up. "Arm's length is how we get here," he said, and ended the call. Back at the table, he flipped open the notebook with care. The ledger of a child who had taken up management in place of play, temperatures, cough frequency, how many stems sold near the cathedral on each day it didn't rain. The discipline of it moved him more than any speech could have. "We need supplies for tonight," he said. "Broth, fruit, clean bedding, a small heater. He ordered what the nearest late-night market could deliver, then called a local GP known for home visits. The doctor agreed to come at sunrise. "Bring a referral letter," Alexander asked, "and be blunt, we'll push it through." Clara's breath had steadied. "I don't want you to make trouble for yourself," she said as if reading his next worry. "Some trouble is worth it," he said. "And most of what people call trouble is just other people's discomfort." He pulled a chair close to the doorway and drafted 3 messages, one to an immigration attorney about reconstructing vital records, one to a social worker who could sit with them through any official questions, one to the hospital administrator he knew best, asking for a temporary identifier and an intake exception if the GP flagged an emergency. He offered to escrow funds and assume liability. He used his name in the subject lines. There are moments when influence is only useful if you spend it. The grocery delivery arrived a case of broth rice fruit antiseptic, a new blanket. The driver returned 10 minutes later with a portable heater he'd found no receipt offered or requested. Warmth spread through the small room. Sophie tucked the blanket around Clara's shoulders with competence that stung to watch in someone so young. Alexander poured broth into mugs and set one by the cot. "Sip," he said gently. "Not a race." Clara obliged. A hint of color came back to her cheeks. His phone chimed again, an email thread from Milan with the subject line, "Reputational Guardrails." He typed back, "Our reputation rests on doing the right thing when it's inconvenient." He hit send, surprised at the relief he felt in committing to plain words. Dawn approached slowly, the sky lightening like someone lifting a dimmer. Outside, a scooter coughed to life. Inside, Sophie sat in the chair with her hand on Clara's arm, vigilant and still. Alexander stood in the doorway, letting the cool air wake him to the day he had chosen. "I need to step out long enough to meet the doctor at the corner," he said. "I'll be right back." Sophie studied him, measuring promise against reality. "People don't usually come back," she said, not accusing, just stating the rule that had governed her life. "I will," he said, "and I'll keep showing up until that sentence stops being true." She considered, then nodded once, as if sealing a contract. He left the heater humming, and the groceries stacked neatly by the crate. As he walked toward the street, he sketched the next moves in his mind with the same clarity he brought to any acquisition: stabilize health, secure documentation, create a paper trail that kept Sophie safe, put a nurse on evenings, and make the hospital say yes by removing every reason to say no. In boardrooms, Alexander had learned to build systems to prevent loss. On this gray morning at the edge of a city known for its art and light, he understood the task before him. In simpler terms, build a system that refuses to lose a child and the woman who raised her to paperwork. He lifted his hand to flag the arriving car, felt the weight of what he'd set in motion, and decided it was the right weight to carry. Alexander Pierce had never been the type to bend under pressure. In boardrooms, he had stared down entire panels of lawyers and regulators without breaking stride. Yet, as he stood in the sterile corridor of a Florence government building, waiting to meet with an immigration officer, he felt a heaviness that had nothing to do with contracts or stock prices. It was Clara's breath that haunted him ragged, even after the doctor's visit, and Sophie's wide eyes that carried the weight of every risk they'd taken. The meeting began like most bureaucratic rituals: forms, shuffled questions delivered in clipped tones, and a measured reminder that without proper documentation, nothing could be guaranteed. The officer tapped a finger on Sophie's name. "She has no birth certificate in our records," he said flatly. "Without proof, she is invisible to the system. Invisible children are wards of the state." Alexander leaned forward, his voice steady but charged. "She is not invisible. She is here, and she is cared for. By her grandmother, by me." The officer didn't look up. Intentions do not change process. It would have been easy to erupt to use his wealth as a weapon, but Alexander had learned something in the shack. Something in the way Sophie tucked the blanket around Clara's shoulders with a steadiness beyond her years. This wasn't about winning an argument. It was about building an unshakable case that love was stronger than red tape. He hired an attorney with a reputation for cutting through impossible barriers. Mara, a woman with sharp eyes and a softer heart than she liked to admit, listened to the story in silence before she spoke. "They'll test you," she warned. "They will assume this is a publicity stunt or a play for sympathy. If you're serious, you must be prepared for scrutiny that digs into every corner of your life." Alexander didn't hesitate. Then let them dig. The days that followed were filled with strategy sessions. Mara worked tirelessly to reconstruct Sophie's identity, tracking old neighbors, finding records from a long-shuttered clinic where Clara had once brought her as a toddler, piecing together fragments of proof that she existed in the world. But evidence wasn't enough. There were whispers that social services might intervene, that Sophie could be removed for her own good. When Clara heard she tried to stand, her frail body trembling with anger. "They cannot take her," she said through clenched teeth. "She is my blood." Sophie clung to her hand, silent but watchful. Alexander placed a hand on Clara's shoulder. "They won't. Not while I'm here." The turning point came in a courtroom no larger than a school library. Sophie sat between Alexander and Mara, her feet not reaching the floor, her small hands gripping the edge of her chair. The opposing counsel argued cold facts: a child with no legal identity, a grandmother too ill to provide care, a man with no familial tie. Logic, they said, demanded placement in state custody. Mara stood with calm fire. "Logic demands we ask a different question," she said. "Who has shown up for this child, who has provided not only food and shelter but love and stability? You speak of the state as though it were a parent. But parenting is not forms and signatures. It is presence. And this man has been present when no one else was?" The judge studied Alexander. "Why risk your reputation, Mr. Pierce? Why entangle yourself in a life so far from your own?" Alexander glanced at Sophie, then back to the bench. "Because reputation doesn't tuck a child in at night. Reputation doesn't sit beside a hospital bed. Reputation doesn't keep a promise." She asked me if I'd come back, and I said yes. That answer means something. At least it should. For a long moment the room was silent. Then the judge leaned back, his expression unreadable. "This is not standard procedure," he said. "But perhaps standard procedure is not what this child needs." Outside, the air was damp with rain. Sophie held Alexander's hand tightly as they walked down the courthouse steps. "Does this mean I get to stay?" she whispered. Alexander knelt so their eyes met. "It means we keep fighting. But we're not fighting alone anymore." Clara, pale but resolute, lifted her face to the sky as if breathing for the first time in weeks. For all the battles still ahead, the papers, the hearings, the skepticism, they had shifted the ground beneath the system's feet. They had shown that family could be chosen, built, and defended, even when it defied expectation. And as Alexander looked at Sophie, her trust steady despite all she had endured, he knew that this fight was no burden. It was a calling, a declaration that against the system love would not bow. The night the ambulance pulled up outside the public hospital, the rain fell in sheets against the pavement. Clara's breath had grown shallow, each inhale stretched thin by exhaustion. Sophie held her grandmother's hand the entire ride, whispering prayers in a mix of Italian and English, too, afraid to let silence mean defeat. Alexander sat across from them, his jaw set, his presence like a wall against panic. He had fought for this transfer, pushed every lever he could, and now everything hinged on what happened behind hospital doors. Inside the ward, the clash of urgency and protocol filled the air. A nurse eyed the paperwork with skepticism. "There is no identification," she said firmly. "Without it, treatment is limited." Alexander stepped forward, his voice even but unyielding. "You have my guarantee of payment. You have a doctor's referral. And you have a patient whose life depends on you doing what is right." The nurse hesitated, then passed the forms to the attending physician who studied Clara for less than a minute before snapping on gloves. "Prepare a room," he ordered. In that instant, the rules bent not to power, but to necessity. Clara was wheeled away, and Sophie turned to Alexander with eyes filled not only with fear, but with the faintest flicker of trust. For hours they waited. Sophie sat curled in a chair, the bakery box from days ago still clutched in her lap like an anchor. Alexander paced the corridor, phone buzzing with unanswered calls from Margaret and his board. When the doctor finally emerged, fatigue in his eyes, he spoke carefully. "She is stable for now. Infection-controlled fluids administered. But the road will be long. She will need sustained care and support at home." Sophie leapt to her feet, tears spilling as relief and worry collided. Alexander bent to meet her, his voice low and certain. "She is not alone. Neither are you." The days that followed were a blur of hospital visits, hearings, and paperwork. Social workers came skeptical, but bound by what they saw: businessmen showing up daily, signing forms, sitting beside a child who never left her grandmother's side. Margaret appeared, once her disapproval quiet but piercing. "You are tying yourself to something messy, Alex," she said. "This will follow you forever." He looked at her, then at Sophie drawing pictures on the edge of a hospital clipboard. "Maybe that's the point," he replied. "Maybe forever is exactly what she deserves." When the final hearing came, it was Sophie herself who silenced the room. Asked where she wanted to be, she stood on unsteady legs, clutching the hem of her borrowed dress. "With my nonna," she said clearly, "and with Mr. Pierce." Because he kept his promise. It was not a legal argument, but it was the kind of truth that even hardened officials could not brush aside. The judge leaned forward, his expression softened. "Guardianship will be granted on a provisional basis," he declared, "provided continued care and supervision. Mr. Pierce, you are authorized to act in loco parentis." The words were dry official, but to Sophie they meant home. She turned and threw her arms around Alexander, her small voice muffled against his chest. "I told you you'd come back." 6 months later, Florence glowed with spring. Clara moved more slowly than she once had, but she walked with a steadiness that defied winter's despair. Sophie now wore a school uniform, her satchel bouncing against her side as she ran ahead, eager to show Alexander the ribbon she had earned in reading. He followed with Clara at his arm, listening to the girl's voice spill joy into streets that once held only her footsteps selling flowers. They stopped outside the bakery where it all began. The same glass case gleamed with pastries, but this time Sophie marched inside with confidence. She pointed to a strawberry cake larger than the one from her birthday, and placed coins on the counter, her own allowance saved carefully. The baker, older now, recognized her and flushed with shame. "On the house," he murmured, sliding the cake forward. Sophie shook her head. "No, today we pay." Alexander watched her pride swelling not from the purchase but from the dignity with which she made it. They carried the cake to a small table by the window. Clara lit a single candle and Sophie leaned forward to make her wish. This time she looked up and smiled. "I don't need to tell it," she said. "It already came true." As the flame flickered out, Alexander felt the weight of his choices settle into something lighter, something permanent. He had given up meetings, risked reputation, and defied warnings. Yet what he had gained eclipsed every ledger line and quarterly report. Family, he realized, was not always inherited. Sometimes it was discovered in the unlikeliest of places, born in the kindness of a single act that grew, until it changed everything. The foundation he later established would be known around the world for helping children without documents for making the invisible visible. But in that moment, sitting with Sophie and Clara over a cake in the bakery where it all began, Alexander Pierce understood that his greatest work wasn't the foundation or the empire he had built. It was this table, this child, this grandmother, and the promise he had chosen to keep. And when Sophie leaned against him, her laughter mingling with the hum of the city, he knew without doubt that he had finally found the one thing money could never buy, the peace that comes when love makes a home. Sophie's story began with trembling hands and a whispered request in a small bakery, a child too young to carry so much hardship, but old enough to know hunger and loss. That day, when Alexander Pierce stepped forward to buy her a cake, he could never have imagined how deeply their lives would intertwine. What started as an act of compassion unfolded into a battle against prejudiced bureaucracy and even his own family's disbelief. Yet, through every obstacle, Alexander, Sophie, and her grandmother Clara proved that love has the power to defy systems built on indifference. Their journey was filled with moments of despair and moments of extraordinary courage. Alexander risked his reputation, his wealth, and even his freedom to stand by a child who had been invisible to everyone else. Clara, despite her frailty, held on, fiercely determined that her granddaughter's spirit not be broken. And Sophie, the little girl who only wanted to blow out a candle, revealed a strength that inspired everyone around her. She reminded the world that even in the darkest conditions, dignity, gratitude, and courage can shine through. When the courts finally recognized what had already been written in their hearts, Sophie found not only a father, but also a future. No longer a child begging to be seen, she became Sophie Pierce, a daughter, a student, a child with dreams. Clara gained the peace of knowing her granddaughter would never again face the world alone. And Alexander discovered that the greatest success in life is not measured by balance sheets or business deals, but by the lives we choose to stand beside the promises we keep and the love we give without expecting anything in return. This story is more than a tale of one girl and one man, it's a reminder for all of us. We live in a world that often measures worth in money, status, or efficiency, yet Sophie's wish was simple food health for her grandmother and love. It challenges us to slow down, to look around, and to notice the quiet wishes of those who might be overlooked. Maybe we cannot all fight legal battles or adopt a child, but we can extend kindness, keep our promises, and show compassion where it's needed most. Sometimes, even the smallest act, like offering a candle, can light the way to a new life. If Sophie's story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What moment stayed with you the most? And if you want to see more stories like this, real tales of hope, courage, and kindness, please subscribe to the channel. Your support is what gives us the strength to keep creating and sharing stories that remind us all of what truly matters.